Okay, so as we talked about, we're talking about fatty acids tonight and how that relates to inflammation, and it's one of the critical things that comes into play when we talk about inflammation. And then the more we understand about our own body, especially when we look at like things like COVID and long COVID, it's less about like the environmental stimulus, aka like the viral infection. It's more about how our body responds to that. So overwhelming inflammation in response to a viral infection or another inflammatory source generally causes the issues, rather than it being the virus itself. It's this interplay between how our physiology is and these environmental things. So the more we can do to improve our physiology and improve how our immune system responds to that, the better off we're going to be. And fatty acids are one critical part of that. So firstly, what are fatty acids? So essentially, the fatty acids are the simplest form of breakdown of fat. So we get fat in the diets, obviously, and that can be separated into saturated fats, like the things that tend to be found as solid at room temperature. And then we have the unsaturated family, and that can be divided into polyunsaturated, monounsaturated. The monounsaturated being omega-9s, which are often found heavily in olive oil, avocado, nuts, and then polyunsaturated. So omega-3s, typically, as we all know, found in oily fish. Omega-6s, which tend to be found more in like grains, sunflower oil. So essentially fatty acids are, we've all heard of omega-3, all heard of omega-6, and probably omega-9 as well. So these are what fatty acids are, the simplest form of fat, as our body's metabolized it and broken down for us to use properly in the body. So, why is this important? Why are we talking about this? Now, what's been well established, for many, many years now is that, the balance between your omega-3 and omega-6 is critical when it comes to inflammation. So, we're going to talk heavily about omega-3, omega-6, this talk, and how that plays a role in things. So, plenty of research has shown that, we're toxic in omega-6 just because we eat too much of it in our modern Western diet. So we often look at this omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, and it's usually high in most of us in the Western society. And that promotes many types of disorders like cardiovascular disease, cancers, inflammatory and autoimmune diseases. And then we look at when we change this balance, we see a vast improvement in all these types of conditions. So, like I said, a lot of inflammation plays a role. Inflammation plays a role in many, many different types of chronic illness. It's the same process happening underneath that, despite it being a slightly different manifestation in different people. So when we look at cardiovascular disease, if we have a lower ratio of 4:1 omega-6 to omega-3, that's associated with a 70% decrease in total mortality. So it's super powerful stuff. 70% decrease in mortality. Drugs can't really generate this type of effect. When we start looking at diet, lifestyle, these more foundational things, we see very significant impacts. A ratio of 2.5 omega-6 to 1 omega-3 showed a reduced rectal cell proliferation in colorectal cancer. A lower omega-6 omega-3 ratio in women with breast cancer was associated with a decreased risk, and we'll touch upon that point a little bit later and explain why that is. A ratio of 2 to 3 to 1 suppressed inflammation in patients with rheumatoid arthritis, and a ratio of 5 to 1 had a similar effect with people with asthma. So we can see all these different types of condition, they're all generated and all influenced by inflammation. This is the sort of key common thing between all these types of condition is inflammation. And we look at these big scary diagnoses, and then we look at actually simple things like omega-3, omega-6 can have a really significant effect on these big, crazy, significant diagnoses. And that brings a lot more control in what we can actually do about it. And that's often not shared in how we talk about how to deal with a type of condition like cancer. But there's so much you can do for this stuff. So, generally what we know is, most of us know omega-3 generally being anti-inflammatory, omega-6 being pro-inflammatory. And that's general knowledge, isn't it, out there? And people take fish oils to get their omega-3s in to bring down inflammation. So, generally that is true. However, there's some details to that. And effectively what we need to understand is that, we still need omega-6. That plays quite a significant role in the body. And like we talked about those ratios, we still effectively want a slightly higher omega-6 to omega-3. So it still plays a role, but we just got too much of it. In effect, if we have the other way around, we could even get toxic omega-3, and that may cause us issues as well. But effectively, omega-3 is generally anti-inflammatory because it essentially converts down this pathway through various enzymes to EPA and DHA. And these two both convert into reducing inflammation, so counteracting pro-inflammatory proteins in the body through these eicosanoids that they could translate to. And that's the effect we want to get from getting more omega-3 into the body. Whereas we look at omega-6, the problem with omega-6, it translates down into arachidonic acid. And the main function of arachidonic acid is to upregulate inflammation. So it can translate to these more inflammatory eicosanoids, which drive inflammation in the body. However, there are some benefits of arachidonic acid. It does play various roles in the body. The main thing is it produces more inflammation, but it also produces these things called lipoxins, which are a type of resolvin. And as the name suggests, it resolves inflammation. So it is part of the body's intelligence. Obviously, if it's upregulating lots of inflammation, it does want to keep that under control in a regulated manner. And that's what essentially a well-functioning, healthy immune system does. Produces inflammation to what it wants to do, but then switches off again. So we can see that coming into play with how arachidonic acid functions. Similarly with, just highlight there, GLA as well. So one of the metabolites of omega-6 actually is quite anti-inflammatory as well. So when we take GLA, when we take some omega-6, especially things that will give us straight GLA, like you see on the right here, blackcurrant seed oil, evening primrose, things that we associate with being like healthy supplements to take. And that's because they supply us with more GLA. And with GLA, especially in combination with EPA, will inhibit the production of arachidonic acid, as we can see here with this arrow coming up here. Now, interestingly, things that will additionally drive this process are things like sugar and insulin being high. So, we're very much talking about fats today, fatty acids, and how they can cause inflammation. But, there's obviously other parts of the diet that play into this as well. So, and we all know, sugar is the real bad guy. It's not fats, it's mainly sugar, and sugar plays a direct role into this. So the more higher insulin we get in the body, more sugar contained in the diet, that can drive more conversions of this arachidonic acid. Yes, so as we said, we still need omega-6. So generally what we're designed to do is have this ratio of like 1 omega-3 to about 3 to 4 omega-6 seems to be the range we're looking for. However, just over time, it's become way too excessive in our diet. It tends to be now that we're seeing with people, it's 1 to 17 plus. So we can start to see how that ratio starts to become really imbalanced, and that's all through diet and what we put on our mouth. So, and that's driven by the typical things that form our modern Western diet. So typically found in a lot of these vegetable oils, sunflower oil, safflower oil, and it's still promoted in mainstream guidelines, nutritional guidelines, is get more vegetable oil, get more sunflower oils and things like this because they're supposedly healthy, and they're still scared of promoting things like saturated fats. But we know these oils are very high in omega-6s. They're very unstable under heat, so they're more likely to convert to things like trans fats, which are essentially a damaged fat. They don't exist in nature. They translate to these trans fats when they're exposed to heat. and that changes the structure of the fatty acid. So it forms what we call trans fats, and that to our body is like a foreign invading structure that isn't natural. So it's highly inflammatory because of that. The body's immune system sees trans fat and thinks like, well, that looks really freaky. It's like this distorted structure. And that's where the immune system effectively defends ourselves and produce inflammation to that. So, and these sunflower oils and these types of oils are found in everything. It's not just oil, you know, it's filled in tons of food. And as soon as you start getting into the habits of reading labels, not the, you know, the graph with the grams of fat and carbohydrate, but more what's actually in the ingredients, you'll start to see this come up time and time again. So it's sneaking in everywhere for us. You know, things like bread have become very mainstays within our staple diet. We're very reliant on mass-produced agricultural products like wheat and corn, and that then translates into, you know, cereal, the basis of our meals, pasta, rice. You know, it's all about these grains and oils, which are generally high in these omega-6s. And are often promoted as what we should have as our foundational part of our diet, to, you know, to fill us up, which is not true really of how we've been designed to evolve in our nutrition. And we'll go through that a little bit more later on. But, you know, producing wheat, producing corn, they're easy to do, they're profitable for companies. So, you know, if the food industry is really influenced how we eat as in our modern era. So it's all these things that have really pushed up to this toxicity. So essentially, you know, we've all grown up with this this belief that these things should be part of our foundational part of our diet. So we all grew up with this healthy food pyramid being promoted, right? And the biggest part of that is all these grain type products, you know, the bread, the bagels, the pastries, the rice, the pasta, that should form our basis of our diet. And then, you know, fruit and veg comes on top of that. And then you got, you know, the lean protein, meat and fish, and that all comes above. So we can see how that's really been involved and introduced into us, and almost, you know, effectively we've been brainwashed over time is to believe that, you know, this is what we should be eating to be a healthy human being. And what we know about this food pyramid is that, you know, it wasn't actually produced by, well, it was actually originally some good nutritionists had a great idea to make this food pyramid that everyone could follow to really promote health with humans. And what we know is that marketing and in food industry companies got hold of this, manipulated it, and it became just a very effective marketing scheme to promote, you know, grain products, dairy products, as well as a few other things. And it's amazing this still sticks around in our mainstream guidelines. So, you know, this is the Eat Well guide from actually the recommendations going towards long COVID recovery. And we effectively see the same thing. So they advocate that a third of our diet should be fruit and veg, which is obviously what we want. And then another third of it should still be this basis of grain. And we can see how that starts to become concerning when we talk about an inflammatory drive condition, because it's maintaining this omega-6 toxicity in the body. So we're going to go through that in a little bit of detail. How does omega-6 generate more inflammation? So what we see is with the cell membrane, every cell in your body has this membrane. It's called the phospholipid bilayer, and it's made up of these fatty acids. So what we know is it's very accurate. The composition of your cell membrane and the phospholipid bilayer very much reflects the amount of omega-3 to omega-6 you eat in your diet. And that has a substantial role in how that functions and how your cell membrane functions, which is critical for our, you know, whole physiology, our whole bodily function, not just the cell. So, you know, generally, if we have a good balance between omega-3 and omega-6, this membrane is much more stable. It's able to do everything it needs to do. So things like hormone and cellular signaling. So hormones effectively are going to go around the body and they attach onto the surface of your cell. And if you have a good composition of fatty acids, more stable, your body's more effective at receiving that signal and doing everything it needs to do. So effectively, like, receiving the signal of insulin and knowing what to do with blood sugar after that. Whereas if you don't have this, you don't get that effective signaling so well. Oxidative stress. So if you have a higher level of omega-3s, EPA, DHA within this membrane, it makes your cell more resistant to inflammation. So what we get with inflammation is we get a lot of free radical production. Now, free radicals effectively cause collateral damage to other nearby cells, other tissues. And if we damage our cells, that sort of perpetuates this inflammatory cascade because your immune system picks up on damage occurring in the body, and therefore sees it as something dangerous, and therefore mounts more inflammation, more immune activity. So the more we can mitigate some and counteract and control some of the free radical production with inflammation, the better. And that comes with if you have more omega-3 contained within the membrane. And it's also heavily involved within the inflammatory cascade, which is obviously the basis of this talk. So let's go into that a little bit more detail. So we have this cell membrane, and when we have an inflammatory stimuli, so that can be anything. It can be infection, it can be toxin exposure, it can be food sensitivity, it could be stress and trauma, it could be physical trauma. Anything that is effectively an inflammatory source that can trigger inflammation. It's going to activate this enzyme called phospholipase A2, and that effectively causes a release of arachidonic acid from this membrane. And arachidonic acid can then convert to things like leukotrienes, which are very involved within conditions like asthma through the LOX enzyme. It can convert to thromboxane, which is all around, platelet aggregation, about, blood clotting. And this is one of a huge discussion, obviously, in the long COVID picture, is that, platelet aggregation, increased coagulation is part of the underlying pathogenesis within the condition. However, effectively what I'm seeing and what I genuinely believe more is this is a more downstream effect and symptom of further upstream things. What is actually driving the inflammation? We see the blood coagulate when there's inflammation present, and that's a natural response from the body. So we can do things obviously to try and reduce the coagulation and clotting, but unless we fix the things actually causing inflammation, that's never going to switch off properly. As well as thromboxane and platelets, we can go down the COX-2 pathway, and that goes to our prostaglandin 2 series, which are generally the more pro-inflammatory proteins that come from that. And this is really where, NSAIDs come in and things like this. They block the COX-2, so we suppress inflammation. It's our painkillers, our anti-inflammatories you tend to go to. And interestingly, when we talk about the hormone picture again, is, what we know about inflammation, it has a very big interaction with our hormones, especially estrogen. So especially these prostaglandins, there's a prostaglandin, PGE2, and that can upregulate the enzyme aromatase. And aromatase upregulated causes an increase of estrogen, and we develop more of these estrogen dominant states when we're typically inflamed. So a lot of female hormone conditions, endometriosis, PCOS, they tend to be driven by inflammation. So we always want to look upstream and find out, okay, what's driving the inflammation? Because we can see clearly how this works down through the pathway into producing these hormone imbalances we see. And that's something, a lot of long COVID post-vax people will have as well, is, they'll tend to find their hormones all over the place. They get a lot of hormone symptoms. And that makes complete sense when we look at from an inflammation point of view. So, we need to rebalance the omega-3 to omega-6 to, bring down inflammation in the body, but also prevent inflammation and prevent problems in the future. And it's very simple to do. We get more of the omega-3 containing foods in the diet, the oily fish, things like chia seed and flaxseed can be quite effective. Throwing that into smoothies, throwing that into alongside oats if you're having that for breakfast, or making things like chia seed pudding. Flaxseed and chia seed also can be used quite effectively when you're cooking, when you're baking. It can be used as like a binder. So you start sneaking this stuff into the diet more. And then, effectively we want to reduce some of this stuff, reduce the grains, reduce the oils, and introduce something else instead. So, and this becomes a game of just swapping in this stuff for other stuff. And you generally find there always be like a vegetable alternative you can use in place with some of these. So you can use something like cauliflower rice, or you can use zucchini noodles, or you can change the oils into like olive oil and coconut oil to cook with, and just move away from having too much of this as part of the basis of your staple diet. And what you'll see with that, we'll generally start moving from this, traditional food pyramid, which we know causes issues, into something more like this, which is more like the Mediterranean food pyramid, which, is probably the one diet that's been advocated as being, generally the healthiest diet we can follow, especially from a cardiovascular point of view. And the basis of that is the foundation isn't this grains, omega-6 toxic base. It's heavily this second one. So a basis of lots of plants, lots of fruit and veg, lots of color, lots of variety, giving us all the micronutrients we need. So as part of like getting rid of the omega-6 foods, you remove the omega-6, but you also leave more space for better stuff to come in. So you start to find just these easy swaps can really sort of build up the diet to really support your health. And on top of that, we have, lean protein, and it becomes a very clean, simple diet. Yeah. So, I think before I jump into questions and Q&A, I think the main thing for people is we just don't, this is so well established and so simple and easy to do, but we just don't seem to correlate things like a slice of bread every day and these like small trivial things to like something large like cancer or an autoimmune condition. And it's hard to like correlate that to these big things, but we know through the research it can drive that process. And the more you can build this balance of less omega-3, less omega-6, get a better omega-3 omega-6 ratio, it drastically, significantly lowers the risk of developing all the types of conditions that are driven by inflammation. So I know I went through that pretty fast. So hopefully you're not a rabbit in the headlights now, and it all made sense. But I can go over things if you want to. So we'll open up for Q&A now. Please, if you're ready, unmute yourself. Please shout out any questions that you may have. Of course, if you don't have questions, then I hope you found that insightful and useful and open your mind to a few things. If you want to join us again, please do keep in touch with us. We have a newsletter coming out every Friday. We generally do these presentations every month or so. I think I have a question from someone.
Yes, hi. Thanks for the presentation, Jamie. Could you explain a bit more about like the difference between saturated fats and unsaturated fats? I think one of the first slides you had a diagram, but yeah, I was just wondering if you could give a bit more detail.
Yeah, sure. Good question. Yeah, so when we look at the mainstream advice, generally they're still quite cautious about advocating saturated fats, and there's still a lot of confusion around that. What we know about saturated fats, it's, we generally shouldn't have too much of it. We shouldn't eat the fat off bacon or like, excessive amounts of fatty foods around like animal products. But what we know about saturated fat, especially like things like coconut oil, avocado, lard, and like duck fat, is much more stable under heat. So it's one of the things that, especially in the functional medicine realm and a lot of other health and wellness experts generally advocate because it's much safer under the heat aspect. So it doesn't get this damage to its structure and change into trans fats like you see with the unsaturated fats. So, we shouldn't be, drinking this stuff, but and generally, you want to use things like avocado oil and olive oil for your dressings, chuck that over everything. But when it comes to cooking, saturated fats are generally safer because of that fact. They just don't translate into trans fats so easy because they tolerate heat better. Interestingly as well, when we look at the saturated fat sort of journey is, a lot of the recommendations on avoiding saturated fat came around quite a few years ago, and there was this correlation between increased saturated fat consumption and heart disease. And what's been developed over time is this awareness that correlation doesn't mean cause. So just because these people were eating more saturated doesn't always mean that it's a cause for this thing. And that's the thing, you got to be sometimes careful with research. And over time, we're seeing that actually saturated fat isn't actually as dangerous as we thought it was. Chris Kresser is quite a big voice in this realm as an advocate of the paleo diet, using more saturated fats instead of these, typically rancid, trans fatty, omega-6 toxic oils that we tend to advocate in our mainstream advice still. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. Although I actually have a follow-up question. I think in the unsaturated fats, you broke it down into different types like monosaturated and polysaturated. Could you say a bit more about that, if that's okay?
Was there anything specific about those that you're interested in?
Well, I guess I don't really know much about omega-9, so you've spoken about omega-3 and 6. But yeah, I'm not really sure about the pros and cons of omega-9.
Yeah, you look at the foods that typically omega-9, like, generally there are a lot of healthy foods. So olive oil being one, avocados generally contained within a lot of healthy foods. Obviously for this talk, focus very much on omega-3, omega-6. So I'll look into a little bit more omega-9 for you, and then I'll get back to you just to clarify whether that's generally a good way to go. But we generally want a good balance between all these omegas. When we look at the structure of our cell membrane, we tend to want a balance between all of them to make sure the cell membrane is well functional and stable. We don't want just to have one thing. We need this balance between them all.
Thank you.
Nice. Cool. Any more questions?
If no one else has any questions, I actually have another one.
Yeah, go for it.
So I know you said grains generally are quite inflammatory and are high in omega-6. Is there a hierarchy between how bad certain ones are compared to others? So for example, I'm thinking as a way to replace bread and gluten more generally, are things like rice cakes or corn cakes, are those still quite inflammatory, or are they better?
No, absolutely. We said, you still need omega-6, so it's fine. Generally, rice is quite a very low allergenic food. You tend to find a lot of very strict elimination diets when you really strict back someone's diet. Rice is usually part of that because it's generally quite low in allergens and it doesn't promote too much inflammation. So it's just because it has omega-6 in doesn't mean it's inflammatory. We still need omega-6, so we need generally 3 to 4 omega-6 to 1 omega-3. So some omega-6 foods are absolutely fine, of course. It's just making sure we don't have too much of that. In terms of a hierarchy, I think removing certainly ones that are we know can distort into trans fats more easily, like sunflower oil. I think that's probably one to really eliminate straight away. And then the other things like rice and, you know, if you are eating gluten or bread and things is just the balance side of things again. You know, there's other issues with gluten if that we could go into quite a lengthy discussion, but you know, maybe that's the topic we can cover one day as well.